All right. Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you to our Justice for Immigrants colleagues for hosting today's presentation. We are happy to be here with you this afternoon to share an important report released last month called A Vision Forward, Policies Needed to Protect the Best Interests of Category 4 Unaccompanied Immigrant Children. This research study and report were a collaborative effort between IRAC and MRS, or the Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Clinic of the Columbus School of Law at the Catholic University of America, and Migration and Refugee Services of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. My name is Lindsay Shaw, and I am the Director of Children's Services at USCCB, Migration and Refugee Services. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. We also have Tony Cube with us of JFI to support if there are any IT issues. And of course, we are joined by our two presenters, as well as Kim Lemieux from our MRS foster care team. Our presenters today are Professor Stacy Bruston and Jennifer Ward. We're glad to have them with us today. Professor Stacy Bruston is the director of IRAC, or the Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Clinic at Catholic University. She supervises students engaged in litigation, limited assistance, and policy reform on behalf of immigrants and refugees in Washington, D.C. and Virginia. She also has expertise in family law and public benefits matters. She publishes and conducts presentations in the areas of access to justice, immigrant rights, family law, professional responsibility, and clinical legal education. Professor Bruston is active in the DC Legal Services Advocacy community, was appointed to the DC Access to Justice Commission in 2017, and serves on the Board of Advisors of IUTA. She has been with the Columbus School of Law since 1991, and she received her BA from Tufts University and a JD from Harvard Law School. Thank you for joining us, Stacy. And Jennifer Ward, our second presenter, serves as the Foster Care Program Manager at Commonwealth Catholic Charities in Richmond, Virginia. Jennifer has worked in the foster care system for unaccompanied refugee minors, unaccompanied children, and domestic youth for 15 years in multiple positions. She has worked as the educational liaison, therapist, caseworker, clinical supervisor, and most recently, program manager since 2017. Jennifer has a Master's of Counseling degree and has provided counseling to individuals and families for 9 years, mostly to immigrants and refugees. She lives just outside of Richmond, Virginia, where she has lived most of her life. She's been married for 25 years and has 3 college-aged children. And as mentioned, we are also joined by Kim Lemieux, who is joining us for the question and answer portion of our webinar. Kim is the Assistant Director for Placement and Capacity Development on the foster care team here at USCCB Migration and Refugee Services. And she oversees the team placing children monitoring capacity for the overall USCCB MRS foster care network. So before we get started in sharing this important report, I wanted to express some thanks to a number of people who were essential to the development of the study and or the subsequent report. First of all, a huge thanks go out to Stacy and her team, including law students Erica Hornbuckle and Kalichi Eke. We are grateful to their efforts to see this process through, including the extensive amount of research and coordination that went into the study itself, and then the ultimate report. And huge thank you to Stacy, who was the principal author of the report, for all of the work that went into the process and the finished product. Thank you also to the MRS staff involved in the project at various stages, including my predecessor, Katie Cunnan, Ashley Feasley, who was previously the Director of Policy for MRS, for their work in getting the project started and coordinating with colleagues at Catholic University. And then Selena Marquez and Kim Lemieux for their diligent work in reviewing drafts of the report, along with other MRS staff who supported the effort along the way. Thank you to the agency staff from our network who participated in the study, including Jennifer Ward and her team. This is colleagues in Richmond, Dallas, Grand Rapids, Rochester, and Phoenix. And then thank you, of course, to all of the providers working with unaccompanied children, particularly during this critical time when the need is so great. So before I hand it off to our presenters, I also just wanted to hit on a couple of housekeeping items. I wanted to mention that the recording, this webinar is being recorded, and we will distribute a copy of the recording after today's presentation. We also want to be mindful of everyone's time. We started promptly at the hour for that reason, and also want to stick to an hour and 15 minutes for today's presentation, including the question and answer portion. Questions can be entered into the chat box or the question and answer function, and we will be fielding them as we go, but we will have time at the end of the presentation to answer the questions. Anything that we don't get to, we will make an effort to respond to when we circulate the recording. So keep an eye out for that. And then last but not least, we have participants joining us today from various walks of life and professions, with varying levels of familiarity with the content in today's presentation. So our presenters will be doing their best to tailor the content to speak to this wide-ranging audience. But please do not hesitate to put questions in the chat box, or remind us to spell out an acronym if needed, but we will do our best to do that as we go. And with that, I will hand it over to our presenters, who will take us through an overview of the report findings and a look at how these issues played out on the ground. So thank you again, Stacy and Jennifer, for being with us today. Please take it away.
Thank you, Lindsay. And good afternoon, everyone. It's a privilege to be here with you and to have worked with MRS on this report. I'm going to share my screen and go through a few slides here to help illustrate. Okay, so when our clinic began collaborating with MRS, they expressed some concern that unaccompanied children whom the Office of Refugee Resettlement had determined did not have viable sponsors were being housed for extended periods of time in congregate care rather than in family-based foster care. They also raised concerns that these children lacked the continuity of care that they needed after their often traumatic experiences in their home countries and their journeys to the US. Additional concerns included problems with kids aging out of long-term foster care without legal status, leading to potentially children going out on their own without supports, or facing detention for those aging out. So MRS sought our legal clinic assistance to engage in fact-finding, to conduct a study of foster care providers in the USCCB network, and to develop a series of recommendations in collaboration with MRS to improve the lives of unaccompanied Category 4 children. So we conducted research on the background legal standards and policies in place for kids in ORR custody. We designed a survey for MRS affiliate providers. We did some comparative research to see what other countries are doing to manage and care for kids who have come across their borders who don't have sponsors. And we identified recommendations. Okay. So the report begins by explaining the category system for grouping unaccompanied minors in ORR care, the eligibility criteria for foster care, the different placement options that are available for kids without sponsors, and the legal standards governing that care. I think many of you on this call are extremely familiar with all of those things. But just in case, I'm going to mention just a few things to make sure we're all on the same page, because our report is talking about category 4. And as most of you know, the Office of Refugee Resettlement categorizes unaccompanied children in its care based on the availability of sponsors to whom kids can be released. So kids in categories 1, 2, and 3 have sponsors that providers have been able to vet and determine are suitable to release children to. So parents, extended relatives, and even non-relatives. So category 4 kids are those who are determined not to have suitable sponsors. And the report does not get into whether that assessment has problems or concerns about who's determined to be a suitable sponsor. It just focuses on the fact that for category 4 kids, they need to be in the care of ORR. And so in order to be, so basically there are 2 primary legal standards that are governing placement decisions. Again, most of you are very familiar with this. The best interest of the child, and ORR is supposed to be considering the least restrictive placement that can meet the child's needs. And to be eligible for long-term foster care or some type of small group placement setting, the child has to be in ORR custody, or at least anticipated to be in ORR custody for an extended stay, which is defined as for at least 4 months, under the age of 17 and 6 months, and determined to have a valid legal claim. Although, as we will talk about a little bit later, that Jennifer will talk about, there's been some new field guidance that is relaxing that requirement for requiring a valid legal claim, which we think is very good news, but it's a temporary change at this point. Okay, so the report then goes on to talk about demographics, but we really had some trouble with this one. You know, like any good fact-finding report, you want to have the numbers and be able to describe what's the scope of the population you're talking about. But we ran into some difficulty because there's very little publicly available information on category 4 kids. And so when you look at the ORR portal information, the statistics that are publicly reported, they show how many category 1, 2, and 3 kids are released each month, what are the total number of children, but it's not really clear how many kids are being categorized or defined as category 4 and in the process for being placed in long-term foster care or other placements. We don't have any information, no public information on the amount of time that placing kids in long-term foster care is taking. So for example, if you look at the website, as of April 30th, 2021, there were 23,000, a little bit more, unaccompanied children in ORR custody. 10,000 or so were classified as category 1, 2, and 3. So that leaves 12,849 children for that month that remained. But it's not clear whether they were still in the process of being, sponsors being vetted, whether these children had been identified as category 4 and referred for long-term foster care. It just isn't clear. And then in May, you see a dramatic decrease, which is not surprising given some of the new unification protocols that we may have time to talk about. But as of May, the total number had decreased a bit, 17,000. 16,800 or so of those kids had been identified as category 1, 2, or 3, having suitable sponsors identified. So 569 kids remained at the end of May. So that does not, going from 12,800 to 569, the statistics don't really tell us what happened there. And so this is just a couple of categories that the report identifies of information that's not publicly available, or if it is, it's in the deep recesses somewhere of some government database. But my law students are quite diligent, and they're determined, and we were not able to uncover things like the number of kids, average length, average number of transfers, which MRS and providers had told us is a real problem, that, and the studies we've read, that lots of kids before they're placed in long-term foster care are experiencing a lot of transfers. So no data. The report then goes on to talk about some of the trends that have been negatively impacting Category 4 youth. And I'm not going to go into great detail. The report does. It goes into quite a bit of detail. But just briefly, the recent changes to federal immigration policies over the last 4 years have led to increasing numbers of Category 4 kids for a variety of reasons. So for example, the Memorandum of Understanding that ORR entered into with the Department of Homeland Security to share information about prospective sponsors, or the possibility of sharing information, had a huge chilling effect on the number of relatives or non-relatives willing to come forward for fear, if they were not documented, of having their information shared, or if members of their household had that information that could be shared. And so that memorandum, that MOA, was rescinded in March of 2021, but chilling effects don't just go away. And so, so with fewer sponsors coming forward, there are more kids that are going to be in government care. Similarly with family separation, that led to children separated from their parents who may not have had other viable sponsors in the US, increasing the numbers. Particularly tragic are the policies such as the migrant protection protocols or the Title 42 closing of the border in light of the pandemic, the public health law that allowed the closing of the border. You saw situations in which families that were living in very dangerous, dire circumstances in Mexico, waiting to have their asylum claims adjudicated, or waiting to get across the border when it reopened, often made the heart-wrenching choice to send kids across the border unaccompanied because they were not going to be turned back. There were some exceptions in the policies. And so you had kids crossing the border by themselves and ending up again as Category 4. So that's one trend, the federal policies. Another, increased duration of stay in congregate care. So over the last 6 years, more than 25,000 unaccompanied children have been detained in ORR custody for longer than 100 days. There are lots of other statistics, I won't go into them now, but one of the most concerning is that almost 2,000 kids, who's 1,890 plus children who spent more than 100 days in shelters, volunteered to be deported, even though ORR had determined that they had viable claims for legal relief. So very concerning. Since March of 2021, the average length of time has dramatically decreased. But again, these have had impact on overall all numbers. There have been delays in obtaining lawyers and legal relief. So the fact that a lot of Category 4 kids had spent extended amounts of time in shelter often delayed their ability to get an attorney. While attorneys provide know your rights presentations and screen kids in shelters, and sometimes even represent them in their cases, oftentimes once a child, as many of you know, is placed in long-term foster care, they're being placed in another state, different from the shelter that they may have been in. So they need to be assigned a new attorney, and the process starts virtually from scratch. And then also, outside of ORR, the Department of Justice and the other agencies that are processing immigration applications are horribly delayed. So a lot of these processes, like asylum hearings or trying to get special immigrant juvenile status, are taking a very long time. And so kids who are getting closer and closer to 18, if they're in care, are starting to be at risk of aging out of the system and facing, at least over the last few years, many of them ended up in detention. Hopefully that's changing. And then the last is, well, actually that covers really both. So the report also takes a comparative look, as I mentioned, and we were looking primarily at programs in the European Union and in the UK. And we didn't do really deep dive on this. I mean, I think there's a lot more room for research in this area. But because the European Union, for example, has experienced significant influxes of unaccompanied kids, we wanted to see, what are they doing? How are they caring for kids, and particularly for older teens, either 15 to 18 who are still in the care of the state, or post leaving the care of the state, but are being provided other supports. And so again, the report goes into a little bit more detail, but the important takeaways, I think, are that the international community, international guidelines such as the United Nations guidelines on the alternative care of children and the UN Convention on the Rights of Children, are unequivocal that large congregate care settings are detrimental to children, and call on countries around the world to prioritize small family or community-based options. So the theory that these guidelines are advocating are very strongly in favor of family-based care. The actual implementation, from what we can tell in reading reports throughout the European Union, is a bit mixed. Countries like the Netherlands have had great success of placing kids in family-based foster care, but generally those kids are 15 and younger, not older kids. Where we saw some more promising models that might be worth considering in the US is in preparation for influx. So rather than doing what we often do in this country, which is each new influx, seems to be treated as a new crisis, and we have reactions to it and opening new emergency shelters and new procedures and new congregate settings that are not licensed. Instead, the Netherlands, for example, granted a much, much smaller country, doing this to the scale we would need to would be challenging, but they prepare in advance so that they have an overcapacity of temporary foster care placements that are ready and waiting, many located near reception centers, and that way that when there is an influx, kids can go quickly into a smaller setting rather than going into congregate care. The last interesting piece from the comparative look was the use of semi-independent living options for teenagers in the 15 to 18 year range. Those programs seem to be used particularly in times of influx, but not just during those times. So there are programs in Spain, Greece, Italy, France, and a very interesting one that has sort of 3 graduated levels of independent living in the UK, in Leeds City, where kids are living in apartments or in group sort of in homes with a lot of supports. But the most important piece, I think, of our report was the view from the ground. With the incredible cooperation and generosity of time that members of the MRS network gave us, we did a questionnaire and follow-up interviews with long-term foster care and with the URM program directors, who we were able to talk to about what they see of the benefits, challenges, needs they have for Category 4 kids. And we spoke, we surveyed folks in Richmond, Dallas, Grand Rapids, Michigan, Rochester, and Phoenix. So we had a pretty good geographic representation. And I want to get to Jennifer, who's going to talk to you about the experiences of Commonwealth Catholic Charities, which is one of the organizations we interviewed. But just quickly, I wanted to highlight some of the benefits that we heard from the group, from all of the folks that we interviewed and spoke with. Just reinforcing again and again their observations of children being able to connect with foster parents, as opposed to being in a shelter where you've got employees, shifts are changing, people are changing, the transitions, that difference of being able to connect, to build community, to access educational opportunities, to receive services, and also to be living often with parents who have had training, therapeutic training, to help kids dealing with trauma, and the rest of the list, the independent living skills, getting legal representation, and being able to envision a path forward. So many positives, and the report highlights some of those stories, but also a lot of challenges that we heard about and that I've alluded to already. Things like delays in obtaining legal representation because of transfers from shelters to long-term foster care. Lots of discussion from programs about how long it is taking to resolve legal cases and for kids to get work authorization and social security cards, things that they need to be able to get a driver's license, to be able to open a bank account, these very basic needs. Different outcomes for Category 4 kids aging out of long-term foster care that was often dependent on the relationship with the local ICE office, which it was great for the organizations we talked to when they had a positive relationship, but that's not necessarily the best way to develop policy. That, sort of the luck of the draw. We even heard stories of providers who were moving kids to other states as they were getting to an age out point because of the variation in ICE policy. Not only for aging out, but also in terms of how much ICE was requesting of kids to do check-ins and to be monitored, and that if you had a good relationship with that ICE officer, a lot of times they were much more adaptable. Funding gaps. The report identifies just needs, recruitment of specialized staff. Funding is needed for more bilingual staff to recruit therapeutic foster parents, and just different kinds of educational resources that I think really were highlighted in the pandemic, but are general needs. And then just, we also heard some challenges of situations in which a family-based foster care may not be appropriate for certain kids. And I think Jennifer will touch on this. For some kids who may not be well suited for sort of a parenting model, they don't want to be parented. So there are other challenges that are mentioned in the report, but I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer to give you a little more flavor of her program's experiences.
Thank you, Stacy. I appreciate you inviting me on. So yeah, Catholic Charities, specifically I'm with Commonwealth Catholic Charities in the state of Virginia. We serve Richmond and the surrounding areas. And we have multiple programs under one department, and I manage all four. So just to give you a tiny bit of background, just so you know my perspective, we have the Department of Social Services foster care that everybody is aware of. We have a program for that. We also have the Unaccompanied Refugee Minor program. That's actually our longest program here at Catholic Charities. We have been involved in that program since 1982, and I have some staff that actually have been on with us since the 80s, so it's absolutely fabulous. In around 2005, we started getting involved with the Unaccompanied Children's Program, specifically the long-term foster program, as we call LTFC. Initially, that program was a little different than it is today. It has definitely morphed over the years. Most of the children aged out at 18. So a lot of our work was finding options for those children after they turned 18. Most of them did not have families in the United States. So it was finding that would provide services for them. Fortunately, that has changed quite a bit over the years, I'm very happy to say. And then most recently in 2019, we opened up a children's shelter, a UC children's shelter, unaccompanied children's shelter, and a transitional foster care for unaccompanied children. So we have pretty much the gamut. We start with children that almost immediately arrive from the border. And if that child does not have a sponsor, they can go from our shelter or TFC program, transitional foster care, into our long-term foster care program. And if that child is able to receive legal relief and is accepted by the Office of Refugee Resettlement into the Unaccompanied Refugee Minor program, then that child can then move from long-term foster care into the we call it URM, the URM program, which for us is fabulous, especially if they go from the transitional foster care to long-term foster care to URM. they don't change homes. They stay in the same home. All of our foster families are licensed as treatment level foster families, so they are all trained to handle high levels of behaviors and issues. That's one way that we try and keep all of our children from bouncing around from place to place. There's tons and tons of research that says every single time a child is moved to a new placement, regardless of the reason, it's damaging to that child. It creates issues with acceptance. It creates issues with, just attachment. Not to mention it upsets their stability. So that's a little bit about what we do, just so that you all are aware of what I talk about, and that's also very unique to the state of Virginia. So Virginia has policies that other states may not have. So when I discuss the URM program, that may be different in Texas, or it may be different in California, or in a different state. And the URM program is not available in every state. So there are some unaccompanied children's programs in states that don't have the URM program. And so if they are able to transition out into the URM program, they're going to have to move to another state, just because of the nature of the program. I want to say we're in about 19 states right now for the URM program. So let's see. What we have been able to sort of determine is that when a child is transitioning from the long-term foster care program into the unaccompanied refugee minor program, that provides them with a lot more stability. Our unaccompanied refugee minor program is in parity with our state DSS. It is not run by our state DSS. It's actually, the children are in the custody of Commonwealth Catholic Charities. So it's a little different than some other URM programs. So we're a private custody state. But the options for placement for DSS and URM children are different than the unaccompanied children's program. We're able to place, Stacy talked about children that really didn't necessarily work well in a foster home. They maybe had never been parented. They'd been on their own since they were 11, 12 years old. And to take a child like that at 16 or 17 and then ask them to now move into a foster home and follow the rules and do all the things that they're supposed to do, it can be very difficult, and it could cause a lot of disruptions. We're very lucky in the URM program. So we're accepting a child from another state, for example. We can place them in a supervised independent living program. We can place them, if they're over the age of 16, we can place them directly in an independent living program if that makes the best sense for that child. Virginia definitely has a lot more placement options. We've also been very fortunate in having children that came and they may have an older sibling that was in our URM program, or their sibling had emancipated from our URM program. We've been able to work with that older sibling, and if we can help them meet licensing standards, they can become the foster parent for their younger children, for their younger siblings, which is fabulous because that means they're reunified with a family member that otherwise would not have been successful because of finances, because of support, because of lack of parenting knowledge. And we provide them with training, case management, and financial benefits so that those children, those siblings can remain together. We've been able to do that several times over the years. And Virginia supports that. Our licensing specialist is very supportive in that type of kinship care. Let's see. We also are fortunate in the unaccompanied refugee minor program in that we provide supportive services for them until, in many cases, until they're 26. So we have educational and training vouchers, which allow children over the age of 21 who want to go to college. We provide them with tuition assistance, living assistance, assistance purchasing vehicles, and we provide them with, some limited case management as well through that program. And we're very fortunate. That's again in parity with the state of Virginia and what they do with their DSS children. Our URM children actually stay till the age of 21 in foster care, if that's what's best for them, or in an independent living setting. I don't know about you all, but none of my children at the age of 18 were able to be independent. I couldn't have put any one of them in an apartment and said, go for it, be prosperous. So by keeping the URM youth in care until 21, it is definitely an advantage. They're most often very successful. Our URM youth emancipate with money in the bank, stable jobs, stable living situations, a connection to either a family member or a caseworker or a foster parent or a mentor, someone that they've worked with over the years that can provide them with some emotional support after they've aged out. It's definitely a better model than a child turning 18 and being essentially just let into the world without a lot of support. Stacy also talked about the delays of attorneys. I will give a shout out to our attorney that we have right now. We actually work with IUTA. And so I have to say IUTA has been amazing. We had a lot of difficulties with a previous legal provider with being very slow. IUTA has been wonderful. And so I can't say their name enough because they've just been so fabulous to work with. And they've gotten legal relief turnaround on a lot of kids that were turning 18 for us. And so it's been amazing work. But there is definitely a challenge when a child comes from another state, particularly if the attorney that's helping them in another state has already started the legal process and then they transition into long-term foster care without actually completing it. It can cause issues between states. You know, the judge here will say, well, why does that child have a dependency hearing in Pennsylvania when they're moving to Virginia? Why didn't they stay in Pennsylvania to finish it up? So it does create a lot of sort of very complicated legal issues. But we've been, like I said, we have been very fortunate, especially this year with the pandemic, in getting legal relief for children. So I have to say, knock on wood, that's been a good thing. Let's see, Stacy, is there anything else that I missed? I don't want to go over my time.
I think that's great, and maybe we can loop back to a couple of issues that you're seeing now.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, so the recommendations, you know, you can see from what you've just heard from the wonderful work that Jennifer and the folks at Commonwealth Catholic Charities are doing, and honestly, all of the agencies that we spoke with, but there were certain themes that really came across, and so the recommendations in the report, you know, if you want to see it, and just the executive summary has them all listed, or if you want to get into more of the detail, there are a number of them. They're categorized into 4 different categories. But for our purposes today, I just wanted to give you a highlight, an overview of some of the I think recommendations that would be of interest to this audience, and that we are hoping to continue advocacy on with ORR, with the Department of Justice, with the Department of Homeland Security, and potentially some change at the statutory congressional level. So, as I mentioned earlier, you know, recommendations for requiring more data collection and reporting publicly about Category 4 kids. Also, you know, I think a big piece of our recommendation, and others have made this recommendation, so we're adding to the chorus, is drastically reducing reliance on large-scale congregate housing and eliminating for-profit private sector contracts. Trying to move towards what has been the absolute standard in the domestic child welfare protection system, which, you know, the standards for our child protective services in every state have long said that you need to have very, very small, either family-based foster care or very small group home settings. So, you know, the immigration protection system has some real catching up to do there. Reducing delays in referrals of Category 4 children to family and community-based care. We recommended eliminating the requirement that kids need to be able to demonstrate that they have a viable legal claim before they'll be referred. And fortunately, I think we can't take credit for this, but the but as many of you know, the recent field guidance says that it does relax this requirement, which is great. So we're also recommending increased use of transitional foster care for children that are 14 and older. As many of you know, the priorities for transitional foster care are for children that are 13 and under, or children who are 13 and under with siblings, pregnant teens. So there are categories of particularly vulnerable kids that are prioritized for transitional foster care. But again, because of the need to move from congregate care to smaller settings, we're recommending that that be increased. And there is some use of transitional foster care. I mean, as Jennifer said, they have a program, and there are kids that are 14 and older that are going into foster care on a transitional basis, but not in sufficient numbers. This next piece is really important, and I think Jennifer gave a perfect example of how important it is to structure placements to maximize continuity of care. So we have some recommendations about ways to have multi-tiered programs where a child can come in to transitional foster care, then go into long-term foster care, and then hopefully have their legal matter resolved and be able to transition into the URM program within one foster home, ideally. There are obstacles to that, but there needs to be a move towards more continuity of care and incentivizing those kinds of programs. And I think the rest are pretty straightforward, although again, the report has more detail. But I think the reducing delays in accessing attorneys, obtaining legal relief, those are some very big issues in terms of the administration of the immigration court system, to try to either streamline. We have some specific recommendations about streamlining at least asylum and SIJS cases and ways to advance employment authorization, although being careful that streamlining doesn't mean that kids' cases are on rocket dockets, as we call them, where all of a sudden their cases are coming up so quickly that the attorneys don't have time to properly prepare them. But to try to reduce delays is critical. And then the eliminating transfer of Category 4 UC to adult detention. I think we've seen in different administrations that this has been used, and it can be a policy decision. It's sort of discretionary, and that we need something more solid, statutory prohibitions, regulatory prohibitions on transferring Category 4 unaccompanied children who turn 18 into adult detention, except maybe in the rarest of circumstances. But these are all children who have viable legal claims, are usually in the middle of a legal process, and putting them into adult detention is detrimental to their success. And then expanding the care and support for unaccompanied youth whose claims are not resolved by age 18. So those are some of the, give you an idea of some of the recommendations. And again, as you all, many of you who are providers are well aware, we're living in a rapidly changing landscape. There are lots of things that have happened even since we issued this report that are affecting the work of those who are caring for Category 4 kids and Category 4 kids themselves. So I'm going to turn it back to Jennifer to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you. ORR is constantly issuing field guidance. Particularly during the pandemic, it has been rather rapid. My team and I joke that we never know from day to day what the new guidance is going to be. So it is very fast moving. Some of the guidance has been reunifying children, particularly in an influx or in a not state licensed facility, for example, but even across the board, even in our transitional foster care and shelter programs, it's been rapid reunification. So if a child has a parent or, they call them a Category 1 or Category 2 sponsor, a sibling or an aunt or an uncle or cousin, they're waiving some of the standard requirements that we had before. And, on one hand, that's fabulous. I am a huge advocate that children should not be in congregate care one day more than they absolutely have to be. You know, if we can place a child with their family, that's a positive outcome. We consider that a success. But on the flip side of that, I also see, because I work very closely with our Child Protective Services communities here in Virginia, I also get lots of calls and see lots of sort of reports from people that children that have been reunified quickly, their sponsorships are failing. Children are reunified very fast. A sponsor may not have been vetted. I don't mean to say they're not safe. I just mean to say that maybe they weren't prepared to sponsor, maybe the relationship wasn't there and there's a very fast breakdown. And very often those children end up involved in CPS, or the worst case scenario, they're on the streets and they're minors and they have no support. And I do, in the last 8 or 9 months, I've gotten multiple calls regarding these very situations. Sponsors, people that turned out to not be who they said they were, people that they were who they said they were, but they just didn't really want to keep a child long term, and they just didn't understand the sponsor relationship. And so we've actually accepted a couple of kids into our URM program that were found eligible that came directly from the community, which is very unusual for us. We haven't seen that in years. And typically that was under a completely different circumstance. Sorry, I see somebody said my microphone is going in and out. Let me get a little closer. Sorry. The other issue that we see is prior that Stacy talked about was the LTFC delay. You know, children that were kind of languishing in a shelter for 6-8 months while they're trying to work on sponsorships, and really they should have been in a much more stable setting with a family. So Field Guidance 18, which came out recently, has worked to decrease that. So what the guidance essentially says is that the child that doesn't have an available sponsor right now, but maybe they haven't been assessed for legal relief, maybe they haven't met with an attorney, we no longer have to wait for that. We called it a good faith letter. We no longer have to wait for that good faith letter. If that child would otherwise be appropriate for long-term foster care, so they weren't a criminal risk, they weren't a danger to themselves, they weren't a danger to others, that child, or they weren't a danger to run away, that child could move into LTFC without waiting for that legal relief evaluation, that good faith letter. So that has been a huge step forward for the LTFC programs, where we're able to accept children at a much faster rate, and that decreases the time that they're in congregate care and brings them into a family setting, which is really where we want them to be. And then if we're able to get their legal relief, we can move them into our unaccompanied refugee minor program. And again, they can stay till they're 21. So it's a win-win. What we've learned from the Families First Act, which is what our Department of Social Services foster care programs are beginning to adapt to. In Virginia, we call it Fostering Futures. I'm not sure what they call it in other states, but it has definitely increased a child's ability to stay in foster care after the age of 18 until the age of 21, and then receive services until 26. The kids in our URM program, after they leave us at 21, they are eligible for Medicaid until they're 26. So all of our children are able to get medical and dental insurance until their 26th birthday, which is fabulous. They don't have to worry about that. And then, like I talked about before, they receive benefits through us for post-secondary training, post-GED training, vocational training. And again, they have the support of our agency at least until they turn 26. Let's see, I think, and that's most of the rapidly changing landscape that we're seeing right now. That's pretty much it. That kind of sums it up. What do you think, Stacy?
Sounds good. All right. Well, the last thing, let me see if I can get my, there we go. The last piece that we wanted to mention is that, you know, most reports, and this one is included, is more of a beginning of research. There is, you know, the more you write and the more you learn, the more we realize there is to be investigated and researched. And so I just wanted to highlight a few research areas that we're interested in developing, and also if there are other folks from universities on this call or providers who are interested, you know, this hopefully will spark ideas for collaborations, perhaps with universities in your area. But these are just a few that have really captured my attention from working on this report. First, the issue again of gathering and assessing Category 4 data, you know, to try to really understand the scope of this issue. The second issue that I think really deserves more attention is evaluation of the impact of long-term foster care and group home settings on unaccompanied minors. I think Jennifer may have mentioned this. There's a lot of research when it comes to domestic child protection programs, but not as much. USCCB did a report in 2017 that looked at the impact of you know, what are the factors that contribute to integration into communities for kids who are in long-term foster care, which is a great start. But really looking to see, you know, when we're saying that long-term foster care and group home settings are the most appropriate or least restrictive alternatives that are in children's best interests, what research do we have to back that up that particularly focuses on immigrant children, migrant children? Similarly, or sort of related, is to assess and evaluate the efficacy of the dual child welfare systems that we have in this country. You know, we have a state child welfare system and we have the immigrant child protection system. And I think there are benefits and problems with both. And so, you know, some have argued, and in some countries, for example, in France, migrant unaccompanied children are treated the same way and sort of integrated into the French child protection system. I'm not sure that's such a good idea here. You know, we have a lot of problems with state child protection systems, but we also, as Jennifer's pointed out, there are some incredible benefits, particularly the increasing number of states, and we talk about this in the report, that are providing services after 18, from 18 to 21, or like in Virginia up to 26. So really assessing this duality and trying to figure out, you know, are the immigrant kids in a different situation needing different types of care, or what can we take from the U.S. child welfare system for domestic kids? And then last, but I think really, really important, and a lot of this work has been done with the domestic child welfare system, is doing an analysis and measuring the costs, the savings, and the economic impact of extended foster care supports for former Category 4 kids who are ages 18 to 21. In other words, there is often a lot of critique, resistance to the idea of expanding care and services that are costly for unaccompanied minors. And yet, you know, in the state systems, what we've seen is that those inputs at the front end reap tremendous benefits on the other, in terms of cost savings and economic contribution. So we don't have those same studies for unaccompanied migrant kids. So these are some of the areas that that hopefully researchers will be looking at. I know our clinic will be. And I think, you know, I urge you to take a look at the report, but that's it for now. We want to make sure we have some time for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both Stacy and Jennifer for taking us through this extremely interesting research, the report, and all of the work that went into it. The findings, I know, were, we got a lot of great questions and insightful comments about the research. So I'm curious to dive in. I've pulled a few questions, and again, if we run out of time before we're able to get to all of them, we will certainly circle back when we release the recording of this webinar. We can include some responses to the questions that we didn't get to. So I pulled just a couple of quick ones that I can read out for the group, and can also take a stab at a few as well. Two questions came in from Joyce Bell. The first was, what happens if an older teen enters our country, bringing with him or her a much younger sibling? Are they kept together? The preference is certainly to keep sibling groups together where possible. Of course, it's not always possible, including when the age difference is great. But there is an effort in terms of placing youth at both the USCCB level or ORR and programs when they're accepting youth, to try to keep family reunification in some shape or fashion, even if kids are going into different programs. But I'd love to hear from Jennifer or Kim, who are involved in individual placement considerations, to speak more to that.
I can say that in our program, we do accept sibling sets, and sometimes it is a big gap. We've recently had, I think, a 16-year-old and a 1-year-old. And we were very fortunate to have homes that can accommodate that. That is one thing we look at in foster home recruitment, is that we want homes that can take multiple children, especially sibling groups. So we do specifically recruit for that. And I know that that is ORR's preference, is to keep siblings together.
Yeah, and this is Kim Lemieux. I would echo what Jennifer and Lindsay said. I would just say for USCCB, we do see referrals from ORR to our program network that are specifically identified as sibling sets and identified for placement together. And so a lot of our programs do make those efforts to find homes that can place these kids together. Regardless of the age gap, though certainly that comes with challenges, as Jennifer noted, but there is definitely effort, I think, at least I can say on the USCCB side, to place those siblings together whenever possible.
Great, thank you. And then for the second question from Joyce, she indicated that LIRS is training families who volunteer to be foster parents for unaccompanied children. Does the Catholic Church have anything like this? So certainly our individual programs, regardless, have specialized training. So each of the individualized programs on the ground provide specialized and tailored training to support foster parents in fostering immigrant children, including understanding different cultural sensitivities and different things tailored to these unique populations. And then also to align with state licensing requirements. USCCB does support these recruitment efforts, and I know in one way is in collaboration with LIRS, with a network-wide recruitment call that occurs regularly to support the individual agencies on the ground in their both recruitment, but also training of foster parents. The BRICS website is also a great resource, Bridging Refugee Youth and Children's Services. So I'll put that in the chat in a moment, or we'll send the link in the information that we circulate along with this webinar recording. Another question was, oh, and anything more to add to that before we jump in? I want to be sure we tackle a couple of these. Okay, great. Another question came in from Pat Millen. Is human trafficking another challenge? Yes, there are checks in place. There's a detailed vetting process for sponsors to address any concerns about trafficking. I don't know if Jennifer wants to talk a little bit about her program and some of the checks that go into place?
Sure. As a standard ORR operating procedure, we screen all children for indications of trafficking. So that's a requirement of ORR. Our attorneys are also always looking for potential trafficking issues. We will definitely, if we feel a child is a victim of human trafficking, we will apply for an OTIP trafficking eligibility letter, because that is one way they can enter the URM program. But all children are screened on I think personally, on a multi-level sort of platform. So we have a therapist who's screening for it. We have a caseworker who's screening for it. We have an attorney who's screening for it. So yeah, we are definitely always aware that children can be victims of human trafficking coming into these programs, both sex trafficking and labor trafficking.
And one thing we saw with our comparative research is that, at least in the European Union, there are programs that are specifically designed, care options that are specifically for victims of trafficking, so that those kids who are experiencing particular traumas and needing particular kinds of support are, in certain circumstances, housed together.
Thank you both. Next up, we had a question from an individual working on a URM program who noted that despite the sharp increase in unaccompanied children, URM programs have seen fewer referrals. What is the reason for reduced referrals? Yes, this is an unfortunate
I can speak to that, Lindsay, if you want.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I was going to say response to the policy in previous years and the COVID pandemic, but I'll give it to Kim, who will share with us. Thank you, Kim.
Yeah, no, that is a great question. And it certainly is complexing, just looking at the numbers, of unaccompanied children versus the number of URM referrals that we're seeing from ORR, which have been really slim. So one thing I can say, ORR has indicated that historically in the past, when there are spikes in flows of unaccompanied children into the US, those increases are usually not seen in URM referrals or referrals to the URM program until a little bit later, sometimes even a year later. So just to speculate on where some of that comes from, for us, for this past year, referrals to programs, particularly LTFC programs, have been really low for certain periods of time under COVID-19. And they've been pretty slow to increase even in this current year until very, very recently. And we do have to remember that unaccompanied children don't become eligible for the URM program until they've obtained legal relief or a trafficking eligibility letter. And those things take time. As Stacy outlines in the report, obtaining legal relief is a really lengthy process. And a lot of times kids are referred to the URM program or apply to the URM program after they get into an LTFC program, and then they need to meet with their attorney and obtain legal relief or a trafficking eligibility letter. So of course, all of those things take time. So just, from my end, it's not surprising that there have not been very many URM referrals quite yet coming through from long-term foster care programs. And as Lindsay started to mention, I think Stacy was mentioning, there are multiple policies over the past few years affecting referrals and long stays of kids in shelters and delays in referrals to long-term foster care, which can really start that process for them getting to the URM program. So hopefully they answer the question, and hopefully we will see boosts in URM or referrals to the URM program in months from now. But I definitely feel the push to want those referrals, especially as we're seeing the need so much on the unaccompanied children side. So thanks for the question.
Thank you, Kim. Yes, I'm glad you got into the details there, particularly on the ORR URM referrals. And then, of course, the I don't know if this individual is also curious to know about the M4 referrals or those coming directly from the State Department, but those numbers are, of course, were lower in previous years. For the last 4 years. We are expecting an uptick in those numbers, but that will take some time to ramp up the overseas process for those youth to be referred through the State Department. So thank you for the question, and thank you, Kim, for the answer. Next up, we also had a question from CJAC saying, are there any programs for UCs who, for whatever reason, are available for adoption? If so, where can we find contact information? To that, I would say adoption is not typically the end goal of the programs for unaccompanied immigrant children. That's not to say that it has never happened in the history of the program, but adoption is not typically the intended goal. I don't know if others have more to add to that before we hop to the next question.
I can add quickly that the reason that is because it's very difficult to terminate, and it's also not always appropriate to terminate parental rights for an unaccompanied child's family. They may have family in home country, and we certainly don't want to terminate rights for a family that could potentially be reunified in the future and has not needed to have their rights terminated. You know, there was no abuse, there was no neglect, they're just separated. That's the biggest reason. That said, I have had adult unaccompanied children that their foster parents have adopted them after they turned 18. So a little permanency, but not a lot of benefits.
I think to pick up on what Jennifer said, the adoption question is a really good example of the differences between the domestic child protection system and the care that unaccompanied minors need. So, termination of parental rights is actually still quite controversial in many cases in the domestic child protection system, but it is more common, and kids are often the victims of abuse. As Jennifer said, there may be reasons justifying that termination, but here we're often dealing with children who come from who have parents who come from functioning families that they're close to. Not all, of course, but oftentimes that is not the need that needs to be addressed, and there are options for reunification. So this is an example of one of those very big differences in the two systems that might call for different responses.
Great, thank you. And next up, let's see, I think this question is for Jennifer. So Monica had shared that she was very happy to hear that Virginia is so flexible with licensing requirements that allow 16-year-olds to live in semi-independent living. Does the program require the 16-year-olds to obtain an order of emancipation from the dependency court? So does the program require? Mm-hmm.
No. Essentially what we do, we're very involved in the juvenile domestic relation court for our URM children. They're seen twice a year until they turn 18. So if a 16-year-old wanted to go into independent living, we would present that to the judge. The judge would approve that as their permanency plan, and then we would place them in independent living. Same thing if we wanted to do supervised independent living, which is typically what we do for the 16 and 17-year-olds that are appropriate. And we wait to actually move them into a fully independent apartment all on their own until they turn 18. But we have had instances where children lived with a community member, and that community member was not interested in being a foster parent, but they still wanted that child to live with them. So in those instances, a 16-year-old would do very well in an independent living setting because they're living with another adult. So those are just a couple of examples, but no, we don't have to emancipate them or anything. We just have a court-approved plan.
Great. And another question Monica had raised was the treatment level foster care home is paid in full by the state or by CCC through a state grant or Medicaid? So is the treatment level foster care home paid? Mhm.
So no. So we have what's called pass-through funding. So the Office of Refugee Resettlement pays for our program. It passes through a state coordinator who oversees our grant from ORR, but state funds are not used. And the children, while they have Medicaid for their health and dental needs and mental health, they're not, their placement is not funded by Medicaid. It's fully funded by the Office of Refugee Resettlement.
Great, thank you. So with the plan to go until 4:15 Eastern Time, we have about 5 more minutes left. Another question came up from Patricia. Are there foster care programs in Chicago? If so, which agencies are doing foster care in Chicago? So USCCB does not currently have an office there. I am wondering if we can pull up, maybe before the end of the webinar, we'll have a chance to pull up the list of sites there, and otherwise we will circulate in the recording if there is an agency operating there. I can't recall off the top of my head. And we can also circulate a link to the page where we have a list of LIRS and USCCB foster care programs. And let's see, we also have a question from Courtney. I work with home study post-release, and we had a client return to ORR care due to abuse in the home, and it took about 1 year for her to finally get into LTFC. In the meantime, her legal case was stalled and started over due to transferring states yet again. It was eye-opening to see how this played out for her, and very heartbreaking to have this compounded trauma. Oh, thank you for sharing, Courtney. That is heartbreaking.
No, I was just going to say in response, I mean, I know that our team, when we did the interviews, we were so struck by how programs are sort of working around these barriers when kids age out. You know, so it may depend partly on the relationship in good graces with ICE. It seemed that it depended in large measure on the good graces of foster parents who are willing to continue working with, living with and caring for kids without compensation. You know, although the compensation is not very high. So most of them, I'm sure, are not doing it for that reason anyway, but still, you know, doing it, or, you know, the individual programs really scrambling to try to find what are the resources for homeless kids and for other, you know, for kids in the community. Occasionally, a couple of programs were able to use certain kinds of state funds, which I think Jennifer talked about, but it was very striking to see the ramifications of those delays in legal cases and the aging out issue. It made it clear that more needs to be done at a regulatory, statutory level to protect kids.
Great, thank you. And I see we have a number of questions still coming in. So I think we'll take one more, given that we're just about to a quarter after the hour. And then again, we'll circle back to folks after the webinar. Let's see. Oh, here's it. From John Seidlitz, there's a question. Is there any data in the report on Category 4 kids and crime or delinquency? As a foster parent of refugee youth, I often hear other parents criticize us, saying that what we are doing is quote unquote dangerous. I love to point to some data when asked this question. I don't know if you know of other studies as well that you can point to.
I am not aware of that. That data is not in this report.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, and as I was saying, I think there is not enough research being done on Category 4 kids. And so I think one project that we're hoping to engage in with some other partners, but that's really needed, is to get the stories from former Category 4 kids, trying to identify what their experiences were, what they think is needed, where they are now. So I know it's not the statistic that you're talking about, which is, is what are the incidents of criminal conduct or behavior or engagement with the juvenile system, which is needed. And I don't know of reports for that. But I do think that showing the positive side of what kids are doing now who have been through that system would also help break some of these myths.
Great. Thank you so much, Stacy. And I am just putting your email address as well as a shared inbox from MRS in the chat. For folks who have additional questions or want to support advocacy efforts related to this, here are those email addresses. Oops, sorry, let me be sure to send them to the broader group. Okay, great. So thank you once again to our presenters, to Professor Stacy Freston and Jennifer Ward, as well as Kim for helping to tag team the question and answer session. We really appreciate all of your time, the great information that was shared today, as well as in the broader report and study. And thank you to all of our participants today for joining us. We welcome you joining our advocacy efforts on this front and the questions that you raised. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.